All right, Captain Greer, welcome back here to Between the Levees. I know you've already contributed some to the new show, The Merchant Mariner, coming out here in January. But I spoke with Mr. Don Sanders this morning for a good hour. Where did you first meet him?
I've never met him face to face. We've just talked on Facebook, and I'm sure we've talked on the radio before, but I've never met him, but I feel like I know him. We've, we've been practice. We've been in the business for a long time together, and he actually, my people are from my mother is from Natchez, and I lived in Natchez for a long time. And at one time he lived there, so we have that in common too. And he's from up around Rising Sun up near Cincinnati, and was raised up in that part of the country. And of course, early in my career, we went up. I went up to Ohio pretty often. Spent a few years, you know, well, the where we started was a long run, but part of it was the Ohio River, and I've always been fond of that. So yeah, we have a lot of experiences in common. And he went towards the excursion, the Mississippi Queen and Delta Queen and that sort of thing, and I'd never had any interest in that part of it, but otherwise we have a lot in common, I think.
I hope to pick apart a lot more of that in a matter of weeks here with that group that I emailed you this morning on. But as far as today's recording goes, I cannot find the Facebook group. I cannot find the post. I cannot find the comment. But you were in the heat of conversation the other night on Facebook talking about how different the river of 50 years ago was.
It was.
So you started in 1975, or was that the wheelhouse?
I started as a steersman. I was a Cub pilot in '75 when I started, but I started in March of 1973. That was my first trip as a deckhand, and it was during the 1973 flood. And I had right out of college, I got a job at an oil company in North Louisiana as a clerk. I hated it, hated the job. And in '73, they started laying people off and closing that office. And I was one of the youngest employees, so I was one of the first to go. And I had in mind going to graduate school, uh, but in history, and but that would be months away. So I needed a job, and I had always been interested. I mean, I've been around the river all my life, So I had a friend who had a brother who was an engineer for a towing company, and I just got a job with them. And I was halfway through my first trip, I guess, when I decided, well, this is what I want to do. I'd rather do this than go to graduate school, and that's what I did. And it was well. First of all, let me preface something here. I was speaking basically for myself, not for anybody else. Uh, every career. I'm not speaking for my generation of pilots. That would be presumptuous of me, because we all have our stories, and the river is a different river in every story. We have a lot in common, but nevertheless, there are some similarities, and I do think there's some distinctive traits about my particular generation, the time we lived in, the river we worked on, the places we came from, particularly on the lower Mississippi. That's mostly my group of people, pilots I worked with, voices on the radios, in the lower Mississippi. And yeah, that was almost 50 years. And when you spend 45 or 50 years practicing a profession, that becomes a defining feature of your life, and certainly has been for me. And the river that we navigated starting in 1973, I think what to me is fortunate about it is that there's a sense of continuity between my career and the careers of all the generations of pilots that came before us. The generation of pilots that have come after us, I'm not quite so sure that that's going to be true for them. The river has changed, I think, that much. The profession has changed that much. And that's, I guess, what I'll talk about is how that has changed.
Before we get into any of that, though, please tell me, from your perspective, how old were you in 73?
In 73, I was in my early 20s. I don't know. Let's see. Probably 22, maybe
Okay.
23, something like
Well,
that.
as a 22-year-old, 1973, out of college, um, what was the condition of the country? What was the kind of economic status? We were coming out of Vietnam, I think, or almost.
Yeah, well,
Um,
we in 74, I think, is when we withdrew from Vietnam. And of course, I was in college in the 60s. I remember the defining year for that was 1968, and that was the year that Martin Luther King was assassinated, and then Robert Kennedy was assassinated, and Richard Nixon became president and went on to have basically, uh, a low, dishonest, you know, almost criminal uh, career as president. And I don't think that some of the I've rewatched several times since my retirement Ken Burns documentary about the Vietnam War, you know, and I don't think that's a fine historical document, by the way. Everyone should see it, but I don't think we have ever really assimilated that experience. It was a rich man's war fought by poor men mostly. And it was for all the wrong reasons. It was, you had the munitions and companies. You had chemical companies that were making a fortune, as they do in all wars. And with our enemies, we thought we were fighting communism, and we were not. This was in a larger historical context. You're talking about the ending of colonialism, of 400 years of colonialism. And this is complicated. I won't go into all that. But my sense when I was in my early 20s was that there was this episode that was behind us. And what was in front of us was something that had yet to be defined and understood. And I think that still holds true. 1973, I was looking for something to give my life a sense of purpose, and actually the river did that. And working on the river did that for me personally, because it was a daunting task. There were the people I worked with were such good people. We were that generation. All of us, we had there was something a commonality that we had too was that we all came from small towns and farms. All of us had worked most of our lives. We knew how to work, and we didn't mind working. Uh, it was hard work. Not a week went by where I worked that I didn't have a 24-hour day. Sometimes a 36-hour day, sometimes a 48-hour day. Where you stayed up loading and unloading barges. You were left with barges in the snow, and they'd come back and get you the next day or something. And we had it was hard, the work. The guys today, I'm glad that the crews today don't have to do what we did. But one of the lucky things for us was that we knew how to work. We were able to, we worked pretty safely because we knew how to work. And it was I knew what I had to do. I got lucky. I got with one of the few of the older captains who would actually help you if you earned your way. And that a lot of luck was required. And then I got to work with people who taught me a lot too. But so in a couple of years, I was able to get a job as a cub pilot, a steersman. Did you want to interject something here, or I'm going on with the story here?
But before you get too deep into that, I did have a question, and again, it's sort of a much broader topic with political inclinations and things like that. So we won't get too deeply into it. But when you got on your first vessel in 1973,
Uh-huh.
the industry to which you were introduced, how plagued was it by racial tensions?
Well, it was still. I mean, this is I think last time we talked, I told you about an old black man I met who had been a cabin boy on the Steamboat America. But jobs like that from World War One, I mean, well up into my time, those jobs were jobs for white people. They did not hire. There were no black employees, or very few, at least not at the company that I worked for. Now there soon would be, but I did not deck with a single black employee. Now a whole bunch of them decked for me, and by the time I retired, the race really had no part in the business at all that I could. It certainly didn't for me, but it did for some people. I mean, I grew up in Mississippi. I know people. I'm related to people who have hated a group of people that they do not know, who did nothing to them, and have invested so much hatred and poisonous negative emotions in their regard for black people that it's them I feel sorry for. But when I first started, no, there were no black employees at that time, and these were all Southern boys. I was probably the only college graduate that ever worked on that boat until later on. But these were guys who had the standard racial attitudes that people from Mississippi and Arkansas and Louisiana and that sort of thing had. And there was no conversation about it because it was closed to black people. Now, there were no African Americans hired by that company until I had gotten up at the pilot house, I think.
Well, please fill me in as to the point of this conversation. The river you first met when you got on the water, as you got into the wheelhouse and started really paying attention, communicating with that river and reacting to her idiosyncrasies, I suppose. Um, Fill me in as to the development of the industry and the river that
Okay,
you got to know.
first of all, in 1972, the U.S. Coast Guard, and I don't know how long they had been charged with with dealing with and buoying that had once been the task of the Army Corps of Engineers, and it was handed off to the Coast Guard, and that's a much more buttoned down group of people. And I can't quantify this, but I've heard that one of the reasons they decided that they needed a licensure system was because there were so many accidents on the river. And that might have been true. I don't know. I only know of one, and that was in the early 60s. A chlorine barge sank at Natchez Island. And my old friend Danny Evans, his dad was pilot for or captain for the Corps of Engineers, and he was the contact pilot when they were lifting these. There were two bottles on this barge, I think chlorine bottles, and they had Natchez and Vidalia and Faraday. They had evacuation plans. People had passed around gas masks and that sort of thing. So they had to send divers down, and lift those bottles up. That was a big, dangerous thing. So that was one of them, I'm sure. But I can understand it because the river was, especially after 73. My sense about 1973 was that river, that flood, it was the biggest flood in history at the time. My sense was that it just tore the river up. I mean, it almost tore our old river control structure out. There was a hole in that they just dumped, load after load of rock in that could not say they couldn't find the bottom of it. So people were really worried that the flood was going to take it down the river down to Chapel, you know. And there were a bunch of places where it did change the river. And I can remember my experience as a deckhand. Man, I don't know. We either had some terrible pilots or the river was in awful shape because it seemed like every single trip we'd bust up, break up tow, get aground, something like that, and have to spend, and we would be dragging, 1,200 foot of lock line up on a hill to catch a water tie and putting barges, digging barges off the ground and putting them back together and all of that. And every day, every trip, we'd get back on a boat and it'd be two big spools of 600-foot spools of cable that we'd have to take our marlin spikes and turn into face wires and long wires and straps and ratchet wires, that sort of thing. So there was a lot of that for a couple of years, that I know of. And so the river wasn't bad. There was one bad place. I remember one where it really changed. The river changed the channel altogether. That was at Island 63. You had Island 63, and then you had behind it Island 63 Bar, and that's where the channel wanted to go. So they built a channel down through there. And I remember one night, this was in probably by then it was 1974, and I was deckhand on a boat, or maybe been relief mate by then. I don't remember, but about almost midnight, we felt the boat roll, and this was the old Joseph M. Jones became the Deborah Valentine. Then I lost track of it. It was a 4,200 St. Louis ship boat that had a terrible tendency to roll on you. We jockeyed it in. We had a couple of steamboat ratchets for that purpose, you know. But there were these stub dikes that are still there, but they were new at that time, and they were just tearing the river up. And somehow the captain got up underneath them, and he was lifting the stern at the last minute off those dikes, and it stripped the whole tow, the whole boat, all the wires on the head of the boat. We had 3 units, 12 oil barges and another boat in tow. And thank goodness for the other boat. They somehow, it was the old Caroline. They somehow managed to hold the tow when we got back up to it, you know. And but I remember jumping out of the top bunk, landing ankle deep in river water, turning the light on and watching my shoes float out the door, you know. I'll never forget that. But that was the river we had, you know. But it was a real river. That was my point, is that it was a river that I could relate to, the river that the people I learned from told me about. I've got a light list. Yeah, I just put it over here just so you see it. This is a 1947 light list. You believe that? You could put it in your back pocket. But if you look at that, you'll see so many crossings. You know that you were back and forth across the river. And I remember one time I rode pilot for Captain Ralph Hudson, Stubby Hudson, on the Bill Elmer, and he was a character. Now, I loved him. He had this dry sense of humor, but I would come up after my watch sometimes in the evening and visit with him a little bit and watch him. I remember one time we were coming down. I think he relieved me at Wood Cottage, and I went down and grabbed a bite to eat and came back up because I wanted to watch him steer Mason Landing. Mason Landing was close. Everybody was backing up. I backed up there. Everybody did. But Ralph did not back up. Ralph steered everything. And I wanted to see him do it. I mean, that was such a stubborn place. It raised those dikes, but it wouldn't wash that middle bar off. That middle bar was, I don't know, it could have been glacial, you know, runoff for all I know. It was rock and clay was what it was. It was stubborn. But I came up and watched Ralph, and man, we had 30 barges, and he was steering it. There were people who didn't steer it with 25. I wouldn't have steered it with 25. But he had that head, I mean, buried out there on that bar. I just knew he was just going to run over it. But you know, he'd slide off of it. Yeah, those buoys would come out on the right side of the tow, you know, and he managed to get down through there. It got down with him a little bit. It didn't bother him. He didn't even get up out of his chair. You know, we pushed him out of there, and I told him afterwards. I said, Ralph, I thought I could steer a boat, but I don't believe I can. Not like that. And he just laughed. He said, no. You're going to do a good job flanking, you know, so you take your time. You don't shake me out of bed in the middle of the night. You know, you keep that up. Said, what I'm doing is what I've always done. And he said, when I came up, you know, you had a lot more turns, a lot more crossings to make, you know, and you didn't have these revetments everywhere. You know, you didn't have a rock bank to land on. You didn't have all these dikes and everything. So if you hit the bank, you just dig a hole and keep on going. You know, if you did sink a barge, nobody cared, you know. So that was the river he had, and the river I got, was close enough to that to me to feel like it was still, a river, because you've got, and I mean there are skills that I don't know that some of these younger guys. I mean they've got a big amp, at least during normal stages, you know, and flood stage. They're able to take these 48 barge tows down the river, or 46 barge tows. Got these great big old boats. It takes a great big old boat just to get back up the river. These days in high water, it didn't back in, uh, you know, but it's a drainage ditch, basically, is what you've got. And we had, they might not, I don't know. I don't know how many of them would know what I was talking about when I was talking about mounting a reef. You know what that is? You basically an alluvial river like the Mississippi is you've got a series of bends that are separated by shallow crossings, and they've got dikes everywhere now that funnel that and scour those crossings out. But back in that day, we didn't have it like that. You would have, especially in lower stages of the river, the river would those crossings would kind of fan a little bit. You're liable to have more than one channel in a crossing. It was going to be shallow going across that crossing until it dropped off in in the bend, in the bend where it's scouring out. And it was hard to, it was hard. You get, it was very swift coming over that shallow water down in there. And you'd get set, you'd try to steer up into it, and it would set you kind of up underneath the bar. So by the time you got ready to make, you had a 90-degree turn trying to come around that turning buoy, unless you did it a little differently. What you had to do was push way up high in the bend and slowly come at it, and then push over that shallow place. And then it would set you from one side to another. It'd be back and forth. You'd be, running like a dog chasing his tail. But back in the steamboat days, Captain D. O'Donnell told me this. He worked on one of the gas boats or little diesel boats that had rudders, and wheels. And he said that boats like the Sprague, those steamboats, where the rudders were behind, were in front of the wheel, just didn't have pushing ahead, didn't have the steerage. So they would wait for one of those diesel boats to come along to help them get up into that crossing. They could push it once they got up into it, but they couldn't make the turn. So you had a very different river, and this river was stayed like this. Oh man, it was hard. It was hard work. I started out working for Canal Barge Company, with the boat I started piloting on. When we started, we went from Houston, Texas, from Shell, Deer Park, up across the intercoastal, up the Atchafalaya, came out of the Old River, went all the way up the upper, went all the way up the Ohio, the lower rather, went all the way up the Ohio, and then wound up with part of the tow anyway on the Allegheny River, about 40, 45 miles up Allegheny. That was a lot of river to learn, and we had a double unit with a little 4,100 horsepower boat that it was a retractable pilot house. If you backed up on it, you didn't have any idea which way it was going to go. It was miserable to handle a light boat, you know, and it wouldn't steer worth a darn. So basically, you had to almost do everything you had to do working ahead on it. And it was a good, hard, strong 4,000 horsepower boat, but that's all it was. And that was probably more tow than it needed, that double unit on it. But that was okay. That was a great experience doing that. And then gradually, Canal Barge Company started getting into barge lining, you know, and I got into that with basically there was nobody to teach us that because all the older captains had always been, you know, well, oil tows had always been on small tows, and they didn't know barge lining very well. So we kind of had to figure that out for ourselves. And man, that was hard work. I mean, the way the river was, you know, you'd come on watch in a place like Memphis, you know, the foot of the island there in Memphis. And if you came on watch at midnight and you heard those windshield wipers slapping, man, you knew you had a long watch ahead. You might not sit down all watch because you had to back up a bunch of times, and they were not easy flanks. You know, in the same way up until the 80s. I mean, the river started being truly channelized after the 88 flood, after the 88 low water. But if you worked on the upper between St. Louis and Cairo, it was horrible. You had about 12 flanks, you know, starting at you know at Fort Charter, you know, and Port Gage, Backbone, you know, sometimes Fountain Bluff, you know, and then you had Flora Creek and and sometimes Cape Bend and Gray's Point and several. You were flanking all the way out of there, and those were not easy flanks. You know, you had to shape up just right, or you'd be there for a while trying to get back into shape. You know, and then sometime in the '90s, they came in there. They had a guy with the Corps of Engineers at St. Louis who had developed these weir dikes, and the weir dikes would scour those bends out. And nowadays, you know, you're liable to come out of St. Louis and never have to touch a throttle. You know, just steer everything. I've done that quite a number of times. So it's a much better river now than it was, you know, when I started.
You mentioned Houston. That was you said a 4,000 running Houston all the way up to the Allegheny.
Yeah,
Well,
yeah.
was the I-10 bridge that goes over what was Cheryl K. Fleet? Was that there when you were back there?
I think it was. I don't know. I don't remember. Uh, we would fleet everything and up the Sabine River, fleet up in there. I don't remember what the name of it was now, but I've got to sit back here. My legs going to sleep. But yeah, I don't recall that it was. I don't know. I don't know.
Well, in any case, you mentioned a retractable. How frequently were y'all running with it down?
How often?
Right.
Not very often. It was a miserable. It was an old style retractable pilot house boat, and it was not pleasant. You had to shut the radar off. You had to lower the pilot house, and we had one of the worst places for me was at Simsport on the Atchafalaya, and we could run the channel span with the pilot house down, but it was dark. It was like being in a tunnel down there. It seemed like most of the time. And oh, I remember one time when I was a cub pilot. Uh, I, I lined up for. You had to line up for the bridge, but you had a little bit of a steer to the right in the bridge because you had uh, a sandbar up there that you had to kind of dodge. And these were chemical barges with these cold, these things sticking up in your face, and so that you couldn't see anything. All you could see was the stern of the tow with the pilot house down, and you had to shut the radar off, put the pilot house down. All you had was your searchlights, which were right there at eye level, and you had to. And I remember getting up under there, man, just death grip on those sticks. And somehow we had stopped in Port Arthur to pick up a barge or a load of barge, I think it was. And my partner had run to town, and my captain, Hoot Gibson, bless his heart, and he thought it'd be funny. He had gotten some fireworks, and we were right there at the, you know, climactic point. Let me put it that way. And he dropped those fireworks right between my feet, those firecrackers. I didn't flinch. I didn't say a word. He sat back there in the dark behind me, and I could hear him, whoo, 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 you know. But I got up through the bridge, up under the bridge. We got the pilot house back up, got the radar back on, and finally sat down again. And he just laughed. He said, "Did it scare you?" But that was, in a way, I know I didn't. Until then, I didn't really have a whole lot of confidence in myself. And I think that was his way of telling me that, yeah, you can do this, you know. And I think I got the message about that time. That was towards the end of my term as a steersman.
Well, what was the physical or mechanical process for raising and lowering that wheelhouse?
Oh, it was air, you had to hook the air up and hope that it worked in time. It worked right. You had this thing you had to pull, and it would drop the air and drop the pilot house. It felt like the whole thing was going to fall on the deck, with you. This was a sorry old boat. That boat is somewhere on the Magdalena River in Colombia now. It was a good old boat. It was a great experience working on it.
Well, the topic of the day was, industry and physical changes of the river over the years. But before we get in further on that, um, you've mentioned before that I believe was it the Vicksburg Bridge was the only bridge crossing for quite a while?
No, you had basically, you think about it, until and this was in the 1870s or almost 1880, before you had the Memphis Bridge, the railroad bridge across the river. And you did not have another bridge across the river in the South, at least as far as I know, at least on the lower Mississippi, south of St. Louis, until the 1930s, late 1920s. Then you had Vicksburg that came along. Then you had the one in Baton Rouge and the one in New Orleans and Harahan, you know. And then you had the Greenville, Helena, the Natchez Bridge. I think it was 41, 42. I'm not sure when it was built. The first span. They didn't build a second span on that one until the 1980s. But you and you think about it, I don't remember that you had the Upper Baton Rouge Bridge, and that would take you to Alexandria, I guess, but it was you got all of these crossings, the I-10, the I-20, the I-40. These were difficult parts of the country. This was the lower Mississippi River floodplain, and you had from basically Memphis south, you had another floodplain nested a watershed. You had one watershed nested into another, that were parallel to the Mississippi. And so it was difficult traveling. If you wanted to travel across Arkansas, that was you had the freight train. That's about all you had. But you didn't have any highways that would get you there, and you didn't. Then same way at Vicksburg until after World War II, really, and you had Highway 80, and I think that was one of the part of the old Dixie Highway. I'm not sure, but this was kind of rough country. Huey Long built those roads, and basically all it was a slab of concrete. That was cheap. He built it on cheap, and that's basically all you had. And the same way, from across the Chapelaya Basin, you had a difficult passage in all those places. And of course, then you had high ground once you got on the eastern wall of the valley. But that had as I believe, I don't know whether anybody has done any serious studies of this. They probably have, but that had a profound effect on commerce. That's why, if you look at the poorest states, the list of the poorest states in the United States, they're all states that most of them next to on the lower Mississippi, Louisiana and Arkansas and Tennessee and Mississippi and, state Kentucky, probably states like that, where transportation was an issue there, and it was retarded. It was late in coming.
Well, over the years you spent out there at the Sticks, how many more bridges were built? How many more complications to navigation did you have to sort of cope with or learn along the way?
Well, there was so many. The river changed so much, and this is something that concerns me. Now, I mentioned that you had in 72 they came out with the operator's license. The before 1972, you did not need any kind of license to operate an uninspected towing vessel. Nobody had one. Well, they came out with the operator's license in 72. 73, they grandfathered all the old timers in it. All they had to have was a physical. I don't think they even had to do a test. But for the rest of us, the group of people that I came up with as steersmen, they all had a hard time passing those tests. You had to take the Western Rivers exam and the inland exam to work there, because you go by Huey P. Long Bridge, you're under inland rules in those days. So you had to have both of them, and they would send us to a school in Helena, And those guys were just not very well equipped to teach what we needed, you know. Somehow I got through passing both of them, but then, I, I, I had, the college, but most of those guys failed them at least once. Failed those tests. They had a hard time, you know, getting that licensure to work. And then there was something that I never did that I thought that, the name is not innocent. Operator's license. It wasn't pilot's license. It was, operator's license as if your job is to operate machinery, and on the lower Mississippi River in those days, operating machinery, was something that you could pick up in a couple of years. You could learn to do that. What you had to work all your life at was learning the river, because the river changed and it was always different one time to the next. And gaining that sense, it was, one of the reasons I loved working with and talking to all those old timers is because they could tell me where the river used to be, and what it used to do here. And that it gave me a hint as to its tendencies in those places, so I could make a note of that in my bar book. And that was what separated a, a, a machinery operator from a pilot. It was this was, and it was a considerable difference to me. But then, I'm pretty sure some of these corporations would much better rather, pay an equipment operator than a pilot. Some of them had actually gone to college themselves. Some of those guys running those companies, and they had read Mark Twain's Life on the Mississippi, and they'd heard about, how important the skill of piloting was. They knew that was a factor, and they didn't really want it to be a factor. So I've always held that there's nothing innocent about that, about that nomenclature, so to speak, because there was a lot to learn. When it changed differently, it was different every time. You had to pay attention. If you saw a place come dry, you better be marking that down, because it's not just going to tell you where the water isn't, if the water it goes up or down. It's also going to tell you that which way the current is liable to turn, how you're liable to have a change in that. And I don't, nowadays, these guys have these charting systems, and they have a machine that knows the river on their behalf, whether it knows it as deeply and as instinctively, it's an abstraction. And for us, it was less of an abstraction. It was more immediate, and harder to come by. And when you have a river that does not change to that extent, and where what changes you've got on this year's charting system, it kind of does a part of your job for you. And that's why I say that I feel a sense of continuity with those old pilots that came before me. And I'm not sure that I may be wrong about this. I don't mean I don't mean to say that we're better pilots than they'll ever be. I mean, the thing you read, I think somebody had made the statement about he had forgotten more than most pilots would ever know. This old timer, whoever he was, I don't remember who he was. And to a certain extent, that's true. I can actually point to places where where there's a willow patch where I used to run 30 barges, and so yeah, I've you know I've seen a lot more river in a way, in a sense that some of my young contemporaries will, but that doesn't make me, you know, they're superior in any fashion. I don't want to imply that. It's just that's the time I lived in. That's the river I had. They live in a different time. They have a different river. Yeah.
Do you think the technologies like your Rose Point, your charting systems, do they replace that knowledge, or is there anything we're missing today?
Eh, Well, it does replace that knowledge. I mean, you know, you've got. I remember when I started in the pilot house. That when I was a deckhand, they were replacing all of these wicket dams and docks on the Ohio River. When I started the first summer, I decked on the Ohio. We made, it was 53, 52, 51, 50, 49, 48, 47, and 46. And then we started making the big 1,200 foot stationary dams that they were created until we got up about Marietta, Ohio. And then we had 17, 16, 15, 14, 13, and 12. And Dashiell, Emsworth, Montgomery, those. Uh, and back in the day, I mean, I had friends who were Ohio River pilots, and they had license for certain sections of the Ohio River. And it was not easy. The Ohio River was before, you had, these big dams that basically turned it into a series of lakes. You had a river there, and it was, shallow in places. It was difficult to navigate. There was current sometimes there wasn't. And you had to know what you had to be a real pilot. You had to know that river. Well, by the time I came along, here we were. I mean, I had a map book and a flashlight, and I was taking a double unit up the Ohio River all the way, the whole damn river, and some of these old men were pretty grouchy about that because they had been replaced, their expertise had become useless to them because of the big dams. So, yeah, there's something law. These guys, they're taking, some of the better pilots are taking these huge tows up and down the river, and that's great that they're doing that. If I was starting out these days, I'd do the same thing. That's what I'd want to do. I'd want to, give me the biggest challenge and all that. You couldn't pay me gold to do it now, but but they've got a river, except for the bridges. Now the bridges, they didn't make those, most of them, except a couple of them, any bigger. So they still got to get through Vicksburg Bridge, and a few others, and that can be a problem with 46 barges. So they got to know what they're doing. They got to be good equipment operators. Let me put it that. And they also have to be pretty good pilots because there's a lot more current. They've got to they better know how to flank a boat. But they don't have to know the river like we did. Now I'm sure in a lot of them still keep bar books. They make notes of where they can run outside the channel in high water and that sort of thing. But something has been taken from them that they are not. That's Let me put it this way: they have they have abstracted. The technology has added a layer of abstraction to what they do. And the whole career back from those days who had wooden boats to guys, who had steel boats where the boats were made of wood and the men were made of steel, and then along comes World War II and they invent radar, so you can actually run at night without your searchlight on, and all of those are layers, and then all this equipment that we've gotten over the years. These pedometers that are so accurate, you can count the fish at the bottom. The we didn't have that starting out. And all every invention, every bit of technology that comes to you is a layer of abstraction. It takes away what it used to be. And that's just inevitable. That's the way it's going to be. They're still not going to ever invent, equipment to replace the pilots. They're still going to need somebody between the sticks, And I hope they're able to find. I think they're having difficulty finding enough people, but hopefully they'll be able to do that.
What do you think about the potential for automation as far as operating these boats remotely? Any such thing?
Who's going to do that?
No idea. Just thought it worth the
Well,
conversation.
I mean, somebody go sit behind the desk and make Vicksburg Bridge with 46 barges? I don't think so. I think you're gonna kind of need to be on the scene. But I don't know. You're asking me a question that's far beyond my, you know, I mean, I don't. We could consult a Ouija board for all I know about that. I have no idea. But you're dealing with different set of people too. These kids that are going to work as I did, they're different. They're a different breed of cat. You don't get these country boys. Like, you get guys who carried a cell phone or some kind of technology with them all of their lives by now. They're they watched a lot more television than we ever did. They've got every generation is going to be a stranger to the one before and after. It's going to be like a different country. It certainly is. And the guys that I worked with, they had a work ethic that some of these guys don't have. They had physical reflexes. When you grow up working on a farm, if you got to go haul hay in the summertime, if you've got to chop your own firewood or clean pasture or whatever you got to do on a farm, you develop reflexes. You learn to use your whole body, and I've saw that during the course of my career. Young men who they may have been athletes in high school, but they did not have the same range of reflexes as something myself. And man, it's a good thing I had quick reflexes, because there were a few times when I could have been dead without it, And these guys, I saw people getting hurt more than we did, you know. So, and then you think about, what does it do? These devices we use, it changes all of us cognitively in some way, and some ways it changes for the good, and some ways I'm not so sure that, you'll have to see how it plays out over time. you know I mean, I know people my generation. We spent 45, 50 years practicing this profession. And it's a different world we live in, different country that we live in. People are different. Their mores have changed. I mean, my life always worked a whole lot better when I was on a boat than it did when I was home. It got kind of messy sometimes when I was home. Although one of the things I feared was becoming one of these old men who didn't have anything in his life after 50 years but those darn boats, you know? And I'm not like that. I've got a life. And I know a lot of people who do, but we've all known people who, who came to the end and they didn't have a life. All they had was those old boats, and that one with lacking the boat, they didn't know what to do with themselves. They just didn't have any resources other than that. So it's going to take time for this to pan out and to see how and then, Lord knows I had problems keeping marriages going. But I know a lot of people who stayed married to the same woman the whole time they were working on boats. Sometimes it works out. Sometimes it's difficult. It's really hard. To raise a family. I mean, and then you look at demographic features. If you live in a place like Mississippi, what is there to do? Not much. If you're if you if you get a job on a boat and work your way into a pilot house job, you've got a pretty good way of making a living. It's not bad. You're making a pretty good living, if you can manage to, but it comes at a price.
Well, in closing, another slightly loaded question here for you. As you've sort of been mentioning already, um, how did you see the industry change from 1972 till the day you stepped off? Demographically, um, the river, maybe geographically, any major changes that you saw over the
Oh
years?
yeah. Well, the major one is what I've already mentioned is it's not the same river, you know, uh, and I don't know what to say about that. After 1988, they they put a lot of a lot of work into changing the river, but then we've got issues like climate change. I mean, we've observed what's going on, with the last hurricane and what it's done. It's worse up country than it was, in Florida. So, and what does that mean? You've had uh, droughts. We've got the Rio Negro, a and the Orinoco, I think, both. Well, they're connected, but the Rio Negro is a major tributary of the Amazon, and they have had record 100-year drought this year. You know, has a lot to do with the land. I mean, the same way in the Grand Pantanal in the Paraguay, Rio Paraguay uh, place. It's the world's largest wetlands area, and it's burning up. It has been. You have record droughts there. What do you do about that? What do you make? What a lot of that has to do with the clear cutting land, to grow soybeans. And you know who owns those soybean farms mostly? The same people who own soybean farms in the United States, Cargill, ADM. You have these multinational corporations, who are who are, what do you do about that? Nothing I can do about it. But that's evidently you're gonna have things change, and you've got, you know, you by 2050 you'll have 9 billion people in the world, and there's going to be a set of problems that I certainly can't anticipate that are going to be challenges, to this industry here. I don't know what's going to come of that.
Well, I guess we'll all find out together, sir.
Oh, I guess we will.
Thanks
Whether we
again
want to
for,
or not, whether we want to or not, yeah.
thank you again for the time this morning, and we'll
My
keep in
my
touch.
pleasure. Enjoyed it. Thank you.
See you next time.
Okay.
This has been a production of Where You At Studios, LLC.